I wanted to begin with a quote from author Pearl S. Buck, who said, "The test of a civilization is the way that it cares for its helpless members." The test. The test of whether we are a civil society or not is determined by how we care for our helpless members. And taking those words and putting them in the context of our present-day culture, where our country, with the passing of Bill C-14, has just legalized assisted suicide and euthanasia, where already efforts are being made to challenge that law, where some people are saying it's not broad enough. We need access for more people who are helpless and vulnerable to be able to have assisted suicide and euthanasia. In light of all of that, we can look at the situation and say, we have failed the test. Canada has failed the test. But if we're tempted to say that, I'd like us to reflect on two things. The first point is that the decision that was made and the legal court battles that are about to happen are not the end of the story. So even if we failed that particular test on that particular day that the vote happened, it's not the end of the story. But beyond even that, the second more fundamental point I want to make is, regardless of what goes on politically and legally within our country, each of us individually takes a test. And how we individually, in our positions of influence, in our personal circles of influence with the people we are connected to and the people we know, how we use or don't use these positions, what we do or do not say to the people around us, how we respond or do not respond to the helpless members in our midst, will determine whether we individually and personally pass the test. And so tonight, I want to make sure that regardless of what happens in our country as a whole, that individually, each one of us will pass the test and respond well to the helpless members in our midst by convincing them or those who would influence them to reject assisted suicide and euthanasia. I want to make sure that we are all prepared to be able to winsomely articulate why assisted suicide and euthanasia are wrong, number one. Number two, I want to make sure we're prepared to have a good understanding of why people nonetheless want assisted suicide and euthanasia. That's the second point. And the third thing I want to make sure is that in light of the reasons why people want assisted suicide and euthanasia, each of us are equipped to illuminate a better path, to provide an alternative to what are very real problems that both sides of the euthanasia debate can agree upon. That there are certain problems that exist, but where we disagree is our solution to those problems. So I want to make sure that we can speak with clarity, and as Father said, with charity, so that we can convince people in our midst that these behaviors, this action is wrong. And then I want to talk briefly, at the end I'll be discussing this, of what we can practically do to concretely help helpless people in our midst. So not just be able to articulate why euthanasia is wrong, but to live out the alternative in our words and in our actions. So in brief then, again, to emphasize, the three things I want to discuss tonight are the following. The first is, why are assisted suicide and euthanasia wrong? What reasons can we give to a non-sectarian culture? So we are a religious gathering tonight. We are people of faith, but many people in our culture do not come from a faith background. So what arguments can we give them for why they should nonetheless reject assisted suicide and euthanasia? Then we're going to consider why people nonetheless want it, which will lead me to the third point, which is the alternative approach we need to offer to people. So in terms of the reasons why we can explain assisted suicide and euthanasia are wrong, you're going to be able to see I like the number 3. I'm going to come from 3 different angles for this first point. To be able to express to a non-sectarian culture why we should reject assisted suicide and euthanasia, I want us to come from 3 angles. I want us to be able to talk about our intuitions as human beings. Then I want us to examine the standards of civil societies. And then I want us to look at the nature of the medical profession. And if we can come from those three angles, then I think we can make a solid non-sectarian case for why assisted suicide and euthanasia should be rejected. So in terms of exploring first human intuitions, I want to give you a number of examples of things that have been in the news or some thought experiments that will explore our intuitive gut reactions as human beings. So this first example, who can tell me what this is a picture of? Who recalls? The Ebola outbreak, that's right, in 2014. What was the world's reaction to the Ebola outbreak? Fear. What were people afraid of? Dying. So there is this virus that's going around that will savagely kill you in a very brutal way. And so the world's reaction is fear of getting that. It's fear of getting that because there is no cure and it will end our lives. For those who could get beyond that fear of contracting it themselves, what was their response? Some people. What's that? How can I help? There were various medical professionals who flew overseas to Africa. My cousin was one of them. He works in infectious diseases, and he spent some time over in Africa. So there was this reaction of fear. I don't want to get that. I don't want to die. And then there was this other reaction of, how do I preserve people's lives? How do I stop this from spreading? How do I help? Okay? That's an intuition that we can say all human beings shared, not just people who lived in Canada, or not just people who reject euthanasia. Even people who support euthanasia, we all have that same intuitive reaction that was a tragedy. We need to stop the deaths that were happening with Ebola. Next example, this is a picture from that same year, 2014. The Malaysian airline that had been flying over Eastern Europe crashed over the Ukraine. And what was our world's reaction to this plane crash? Tragic. Why was it tragic? People died. Innocent human beings lost their lives, and intuitively our world reacted with sadness that this was a tragedy. Now, interestingly, there was a couple by the name of Barry and Izzy Sim who, with their little baby, were trying to get on that very Malaysian airline flight. But the flight could not accommodate this family of three, and they were forced to take the next flight. What do you think their reaction was when they heard about this plane crash? Elation. A sigh of relief. Sadness for those who lost their lives, but that sense of relief that what? Their lives were preserved. Not too far from here, of course, the tragic Fort McMurray fires that happened in just the past couple months. What was the first response, the number one priority of emergency personnel? Evacuate. And evacuate who? People, right? Even not all the animals were evacuated, because there were some individuals who snuck back into Fort McMurray to try to rescue the animals that were stranded there. But this intuitive reaction in the face of danger, fire that would end life, and this intuitive reaction to preserve life tells us something. My next point is just a simple thought experiment. Imagine you go to a grocery store, you run into an elderly friend of yours, and as you're talking and catching up on life, your friend says to you, "Guess what? My first grandchild was born today." What are you going to say? Congratulations. Now, as the conversation progresses, let's imagine that this same friend says, "Now, you're not going to believe what news we recently got. My husband has just been diagnosed with cancer, and he's been given 4 weeks to live." Now, what's your reaction going to be? Sympathy. I'm sorry. You hear about new life, and you have jubilation. You have words of congratulation. But you hear about the loss of life, even if it's a well-lived life, even if it's a life that is seeming to be near its natural end, and that impending end, that end coming soon, you nonetheless instinctively react with sorrow. So I bring all these examples up, which you can bring up in conversations with others, to show that we need to reject assisted suicide and euthanasia, first of all, because they go against our basic human intuitions. And our basic human intuition is to preserve life. It's to protect life. And although we acknowledge that death is a part of life, we intuitively know we are not to run to death. We are not to seek death. In all of these examples, our intuitions tell us death is a part of life, but it's something to mourn. Whereas life itself is something to celebrate, it's something we preserve, it's something we protect. So that's the first angle we can come from. The second angle we can come from to speak to a non-sectarian culture for why we should reject assisted suicide and euthanasia is to examine the standard of civil societies. To help people understand what kind of is at the heart of a civil society, we can begin by discussing its opposite, a barbaric society. So if I were to ask you, or you were to ask someone you're in conversation with, what are some examples that come to mind of what would be classified as a barbaric or an inhumane society? Nazi Germany. Okay, that's one example that typically comes to people's mind. What other examples can you think of barbaric societies? The genocide in Rwanda. So we've got the Holocaust, we've got the genocide in Rwanda. Some people in other audiences I've spoken to have said ISIS. And if we look at these examples, what is the common thread with all of them? Killing, directly and intentionally killing innocent human beings, treating a human being as an object that is disposable instead of a subject that is unrepeatable and irreplaceable. So barbaric societies treat human beings as objects that can be disposed of. In barbaric societies, an inherent or an inalienable right to life does not exist. In barbaric societies, what exists is a conditional right to life. There are some groups of people within barbaric societies whose lives are protected, but their lives are only protected because they meet certain conditions. So they are from a certain ethnic group, or they look a certain way, or they hold a certain religious belief, or reject a different kind of religious belief, or they can function and perform at a certain level that other people cannot. So in barbaric societies, the right to life of an individual is not grounded in the existence of the individual. It is grounded in conditions that other individuals have stipulated need to be the case, so that it's not inherently wrong to kill someone in a barbaric society. It's only conditionally wrong. Oh, well, did that victim fit this criteria and fall into that camp? Well, if yes, then okay, it's wrong because they met a set of conditions. But if you don't meet those conditions, then it's not wrong. So in light of that, what then separates a civil society from a barbaric one? Well, a civil society holds to the idea that everyone has the right to life. And this is then expressed in, you could say, foundational documents of civil societies. So in our own country here, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms says everyone has the right to life. There are some elements of our charter that don't apply to everyone. There are some rights that only apply to Canadians. But the right to life is not specific to being Canadian. The right to life is specific to being part of the category everyone. Therefore, the right to life is not conditional, it is inalienable, or it is inherent. The same can be said for the United States Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. This sense that all humans are equal and have the right to life. The United Nations, in its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, expresses this same sentiment. They say all members of the human family have the right to life. So what we see with civil societies is that by virtue of being a member of the human family, you have the right to life. What conditions apply to you in terms of what you look like or what beliefs you have or what ethnicity you come from are irrelevant. If you exist, then I respect your life. Now, this is significant because assisted suicide and euthanasia go against the idea that the right to life is inherent, that therefore the wrongness of killing someone is inherent. So it doesn't matter what the situation is, it's always wrong to directly and intentionally kill the innocent human being in a civil society. But with assisted suicide and euthanasia, what they say is no, it is only wrong to kill you under certain conditions. But under other conditions, it's okay to kill you. So we move from a culture where we have an unconditional right to life or an inalienable right to life to then embracing the philosophy of a barbaric culture where your right to life is only based on certain conditions. It's only wrong to kill you under certain conditions. Now, someone who supports assisted suicide and euthanasia might reject my lumping that philosophy into that of barbaric cultures and say, no, wait a minute, there's a big difference between barbaric cultures and a culture that embraces euthanasia. Because with a barbaric culture, it's person A determining they can kill person B, and that's obviously wrong. But a culture that embraces euthanasia is simply person A wanting to die themselves and just needing to enlist the help of person B. But the person being killed is individual A, not B, and A actually wants to die. So the only condition allowed is that the victim has to desire it. And so what I want to do is respond with several points to show the problem that arises when even we only allow that one condition. So the first thing we need to realize is just because someone desires something, it doesn't mean we should follow through on that desire. Now, if you just make that statement to someone in our culture, they might react and say, well, no, I don't agree with you. So it's helpful if you give analogies. So what I like to point out to people is the following. In my old elementary school, there was a girl who, when she was in kindergarten, contracted meningitis. And it was so severe and was spreading so rapidly throughout her body that she would die unless severe amputations occurred. And so the doctors had to amputate both of her arms from just below the elbow down and both of her legs from just above the knee down. Now, would we say that doctor who amputated her limbs, would we say that doctor did a good action? Yes. Why? Well, because this patient's life was going to end, and the only way to preserve it was to amputate her limbs. What if instead of a patient having meningitis, you have a patient with BIID? BIID stands for Body Integrity Identity Disorder. In short, this is a condition which exists where people who have perfectly healthy limbs, functioning well, no sign of a pathology, these individuals with BIID desperately desire to become amputees. Someone with BIID, I'm not making this up, would go to their doctor and beg their doctor to amputate their arm or amputate their leg. If a physician in that context removed that individual's healthy arm, would you say that doctor did a good action or a bad action? A bad action. Now, what if someone responds and says, yes, but just because someone desires something, it doesn't necessarily follow that we should follow through. So you see how that simple story, that simple analogy illustrates the principle that I just communicated, which is just because someone has the desire, it doesn't mean that we should follow through. The next point we want to make is that if the only condition allowed is that the victim has to wish their own death, then why would we be sending mental health workers up to Atawaskapat? Why would our news media be crying out about the tragedy of, I think it was 5 suicides in 4 or 5 months in Woodstock, Ontario, amongst teenagers? Why would we try to stop these suicides amongst young people if they fit the condition of desiring death? And inevitably, what a lot of people would say, not all, because there are some who would be proponents of teenagers or even children being allowed to consent to euthanasia, but the average person would recoil in these examples and say, well, no, it would be wrong to assist suicide in those cases. We need to try to preserve these teenagers' lives. So even though they desire death, they don't meet the criteria of being near death. They have their whole lives ahead of them. So here's the problem when the right to life becomes conditional. Here's the problem when the wrongness of killing someone becomes conditional. Inevitably, one condition splits into two, and two splits into more. So we began with only one condition: you have to desire death. But once we see that some teenagers desire death and we don't want teenagers committing suicide, we add a new condition. And the new condition is not only do you have to desire death, but you have to be near death. So here's the problem with a conditional right to life and it being only conditionally wrong to kill someone. Who's to determine how close to death you have to be? Is it 6 weeks? What about 6 months? What about a year? The moment we start saying it's only conditionally wrong to kill someone, we create this kind of situation. The other thing that then happens is someone will say, well, you know, you need to will to die, and you need to be near death, and you have to be suffering. So again, notice how now a third condition gets tacked on. And then we have to ask the question, who determines what degree of suffering must be present in order to justify assisted suicide? First of all, suffering is part of the human experience. All of us suffer. All of us have, and all of us will continue to, because we're living in an imperfect world. Some of us will suffer more physically. Others will suffer more emotionally. Others might suffer more psychologically or relationally or spiritually. But the point is, we all are going to suffer. And who's to say that their suffering is worse than someone else's suffering? Isn't, at the end of the day, the experience of suffering subjective? And so if the condition simply is that suffering must be present, then we're all candidates for assisted suicide and euthanasia. So the point of bringing this up when it comes to looking at civil societies versus barbaric ones is to show that I'm not saying a culture which allows assisted suicide and euthanasia is identical to cultures which allowed, you know, killing of people based on their ethnicity or religious view or whatever the case may be. I'm not saying they're identical, but I'm saying they're comparable. And what's comparable about them is that both kinds of societies do not acknowledge that every individual has an inalienable or inherent right to life, but instead they only say that you have a conditional right to life. If you meet certain conditions, then we protect your life, but if you don't meet those conditions, then we can end your life. And that's a problem with the examples that I've given. The third angle that I want to explain to you, that you can explain to others, that we can come from, is to look at the nature of the medical profession. Why do we have hospitals? When you're in pain, or one of your loved ones is sick, and you take them to the doctor, or you go to the hospital, what are your expectations? To preserve life, to get better, exactly. We expect that we're going to be treated with compassion, that our pain is going to be, if not eliminated, it's at least going to be alleviated, that our illness, hopefully, will be healed or treated to the best of the physician's capabilities. We expect that in the medical community that there are standards. So for example, the World Medical Association has said in its Declaration of Geneva, I will maintain the utmost respect for human life. We expect in the medical community, as the Canadian Medical Association lays out in its Code of Ethics, that they have to act with compassion, that they have to act with beneficence, that they have to act with the concept of doing no harm. If you think for a moment about the medical profession, it's often associated with Hippocrates, and we hear about the Hippocratic Oath that doctors are supposed to say. And I will say that now when med students graduate from medical school, they do take a Hippocratic Oath, but it is not the original Hippocratic Oath, which was the Oath of Hippocrates, a Greek physician who lived in 460 BC. The wording has been changed to remove parts that would cause med students about to be doctors to be declaring that they are against euthanasia and abortion, essentially. That's the language that is removed. But if we go back to Hippocrates and that standard of medicine, which is supposed to be what's guiding our medical community now, we can reflect on the words of libertarian anthropologist Margaret Mead, who, when talking about Hippocratic medicine, said, for the first time in our tradition, when talking about the instigation of Hippocratic medicine, for the first time in our tradition, there was a complete separation between killing and curing. Throughout the primitive world, she says, the doctor and the sorcerer tended to be the same person. He, with the power to kill, also had the power to cure, especially the undoing of his own killing activities. With the Greeks, suddenly a distinction was made clear. The physician is no longer the sorcerer. If you're involved in healing, you're not in the business of killing. And there are times where the medical community makes this very clear. To give you an example, Pfizer, how many of you recognize this label or this name? Pharmaceutical company, and they came out very interestingly just within the last 2 months. On May 13th, they came out with a very significant announcement, and they said on May 13th of this year that they would impose strict distribution controls to block states in the United States from obtaining and using Pfizer's medicine in executions. So in some American states where the death penalty is legal and where Pfizer's pharmaceuticals will do the job and end the life of the criminal, Pfizer has come out and said, we as a pharmaceutical company are in the business of healing. We're not in the business of killing. And we don't care if your executions are legally sanctioned. Even if they're legally sanctioned, Pfizer said, we are not going to allow you to use our medicine to end life. And this isn't Pfizer in isolation. All the other major pharmaceutical companies came out echoing Pfizer's sentiments. They weren't the only ones. Then the American Medical Association also came out and said that they are troubled by the continuous refusal of many state courts and legislatures to acknowledge the ethical obligations of physicians, which strictly prohibit physician involvement in legally authorized executions. And the AMA said, requiring physicians to participate in executions violates their oath to protect lives and erodes public confidence in the medical profession. That was also echoed by the Association of EMTs. So all these medical bodies are getting together and saying, wait a minute, you can't use us or you can't use our medicines to end lives because we take an oath to protect life. And if we violate that, we're going to be eroding public confidence in the medical profession. And so we can use this as an example to say, this is why we need to reject assisted suicide and euthanasia, because they go against the nature of a medical profession, which is designed to heal, not kill. Where physicians, if they take an oath to protect life, we as patients need to have confidence that when we go to them, that they will protect our lives, not harm our lives. So to summarize this first point, which had these 3 subheadings, we can explain to the culture that assisted suicide and euthanasia should be rejected because they go against our intuitions as human beings, because they violate the nature of a civil society and make the wrongness of killing someone conditional rather than inherently wrong to kill someone. And the third reason is that it goes against the nature of the medical profession, which is designed to heal and help human beings, not harm human beings. But in light of all of that, there are still many in our culture, unfortunately a large percentage of people in our culture, and a large percentage of people in our church who think assisted suicide and euthanasia are okay. I just read a poll that said 70% of Catholics think assisted suicide and euthanasia are acceptable. That's not 17, that's 70. So we have a lot of work to do in our own backyard, and the starting point is to seek to understand why people think it is acceptable and then illuminate the alternative path. So why do people want assisted suicide and euthanasia? Well, I did a lot of research in preparation to be able to give talks like this. I watched a lot of documentaries of people who wanted assisted suicide and euthanasia, some who got it in foreign countries, like going over to Switzerland, others who were fighting to get it in Canada before the law changed. And there's one overarching motivation that I observed, and then there's 5 others that I'm going to go through in more detail. The overarching motivation that I saw was control. As I was studying all the people that really wanted assisted suicide and euthanasia, it was control. And here's what are some of the people in the documentaries I watched said. This is my life, my life. It should be my death. One of the narrators in one of the documentaries said, peaceful, quick, and as he wished. Another narrator said, it's about control, the rise of autonomy. And in response to people's obsession with control and autonomy, I think it's helpful to reflect on the words of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he once said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly, he said, affects all indirectly. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So a lot of the people that were talking about control, at the end of the day, were saying, look, it's just my life. It has nothing to do with you. It has no impact on you, so let me do what I want. And our response needs to be whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. If you're in a bad mood at the grocery store when you're paying for your groceries, that can affect the person at the till. Everything about us, because we are caught in this inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, how we feel and how we act and what we do will impact other people. And is it fair to impact other people in the way that fighting for our right to our own death will have that kind of impact? First of all of us who don't have assisted suicide are left in the wake of those people's decisions. We're left with their absence in our world. But moreover, if someone were to say, I need the law to change so I can access assisted suicide and euthanasia, what happens if once the law changes, someone claims they want assisted suicide, but they don't actually? But because it's legal, they feel guilted into it. They feel they have an obligation to ask for it. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so if we were to concede for the sake of argument, and it's only for the sake of argument, that it would be an act of injustice to deprive someone of their right to die when they want, I think we could get everyone in our culture to agree it would be an act of injustice to take away someone's life before they actually want it to end. So if we have to live in a world where both could happen, and we had to pick one rather, what's worse? Living in a world where your ability to die isn't completely taken away from you, because you will die, but when you want to die will be postponed a bit. So you'll get your death, just not when you want it. Or we live in a world where you don't want to die yet, but people are taking your life, and that's a permanent decision. Once your life is taken, you will never get to live this life again. So if in both cases someone feels their rights are being infringed upon, it is worse to permanently take away someone's life than to temporarily postpone the death of someone else. And so we need to bring people back to this idea that the decisions they make will affect others, and we have a duty and a responsibility to respect our fellow human beings' lives. But more specifically, as I said, I identified 5 main reasons for assisted suicide and euthanasia. So what I want to do now is explore each one of the reasons, and as I do so, I'm going to be interweaving the third part of my presentation, which is our response, and illuminating the alternative in the light of these reasons, an alternative to assisted suicide and euthanasia. So in terms of why, besides control, people would want assisted suicide and euthanasia, the very obvious one that comes to a lot of people's minds is what? Let's see if we're on the same wavelength. Pain, right? Physical pain. People are thinking, if I'm going to be in pain, then I need assisted suicide, I need euthanasia. So what can our response be? Yeah, pain management. We want to have pain management. So what does that look like more specifically? Well, first of all, we can give people the good news. And the good news is that conventional medications such as morphine or other narcotics are able to control up to 97% of pain. So the vast majority of pain can be controlled. But if you're talking to someone who supports assisted suicide and euthanasia, what are they going to focus on? The 3%, that's right. So we will deal with that in a moment, but I think it's important to start with the fact that we have advanced tremendously as a society to be able to address people's pain. I also think it's important, before talking about the 3%, that we address some misconceptions people have. What condition do we often hear about on the news that people will say, if this happens to me or because this happened to someone I know, this is why we need assisted suicide? ALS, exactly. Lou Gehrig's disease. And ALS is a progressive neurodegenerative disease. So it affects the nerve cells in your body, basically leads to paralysis. It's very debilitating, and it's frightening because your brain can be very high functioning, but your body is not. So you essentially will become a brain trapped in a body, and as the disease progresses, you'll have very limited ability to communicate, to the point that maybe only you can communicate by blinking. And so it's a very scary disease to have, but a lot of people are led to believe that it's a painful disease. And we need to be able to provide clarity on an issue that people are confused about. And so what I did was not go to an anti-euthanasia site, I just went to the ALS website to see what the ALS Society had to say about pain and having Lou Gehrig's disease. And they say, people fear their loved ones will die choking. The reality is most people with ALS die very peacefully. And for those who do have trouble breathing or who experience choking, there are things that can be done to reduce or eliminate these problems. And then they go into the detail of what that looks like. They also say on their site, there is no reason that people with ALS have to live in pain. So if we're talking about pain and we're talking about ALS, this is the first point we want to make. If we're talking about pain in general, then we want to make that point about the vast majority of pain we have advanced technology to be able to control. But we have to be intellectually honest. And we have to admit that we can't solve all experiences of physical pain. And this is a problem. And the philosophy that I repeat time and again is, in light of this, we ought to alleviate suffering, but not eliminate the sufferer. So even when we can't completely get rid of all the pain because of technology not advancing as far as we want, shouldn't we alleviate suffering instead of eliminating the sufferer? What does that look like, even if it doesn't mean we can eliminate pain entirely? Well, I'm going to play for you a short video clip of someone who lives in excruciating pain. This is a young boy by the name of Jonathan Petra, who has a very rare condition called EB for short, or epidermolysis bullosa. And essentially what EB involves is it being a debilitating skin condition where any touch or friction to the skin causes severe painful blisters to burst out throughout the whole body. Consuming food and the contact of the food down your esophagus can result in painful blisters all the way down your esophagus. So this, if we're going to talk about living with pain, this is an extremely painful condition to live with. But I want to play this video clip to show that our response ought not be assisted suicide and euthanasia.
To help manage his condition and prevent infection, Jonathan and Tina must go through the most excruciating process of Jonathan's day, his bath.
1, 2, 3, up.
Once he's fully soaked, the two carefully remove all the bandages from Jonathan's body. It's an incredibly delicate process.
It's always that battle between pain and not. What?
Nothing, I just want you to keep taking your dressing off. Is there more skin on your hand? Yeah. I saw it, Johnny. You didn't have to show me. I know, I saw that too.
So then, it really hurts for her, obviously.
The bath is just the first part of the process. The second part involves putting a new set of dressings on his body. In total, the bath and dressing can take over 3 hours, and Jonathan and Tina must do it every other day.
Probably the biggest challenge, being so helpless in front of your kid and having to do dressings. And I mean, you're the one who's hurting him. I've had Jonathan begging me to stop, and I can't.
This is not an easy process. It's one thing to hear about it, but it's another to see it. It's a lot different than what you think. You just see how, we work as a team to do what has to be done, really.
Ta-da! We are finished.
Woo! Can I go to bed?
There you go. I'm done.
Where do you get the strength to get up every morning knowing what you're going to have to go through?
That strength comes from the people around me, because they do believe in me that I can get through it.
For years, Jonathan believed he was the only one going through the pain. Until 2012, when he was invited to an EB conference in Toronto. It was a conference that changed his life.
I had never met anyone with my condition. I had never, had any explanation. I had never known there was anyone else.
How did you feel when you saw the other kids that had it?
I knew that I wasn't alone anymore. I knew since then that I was going to become, an ambassador. I wanted to start helping other people with EB.
In October of 2014, Jonathan put his story out to the world. With the help of the Ottawa Citizen, Jonathan courageously revealed his wounds to the masses. The article went viral throughout Ottawa and landed on a special team's doorstep.
I read it, and it was so moving that I brought the article in, and we talked about what we could do to help in any way we could.
November 20th, 2014. The Ottawa Senators invite Jonathan to a game and make him a scout for the day. He signs a pro contract from GM Brian Murray and takes questions from the media.
Is there any one particular area of the Senators you're going to be focusing in on tonight, or is it the whole team that you're going to watch?
A team isn't just made of one player, it's all of them, so I'll be watching the whole team.
The Ottawa Senators are proud to welcome their newest professional scout to the organization, Jonathan Pitt. Jonathan, welcome to the organization. Enjoy the game.
Since his day with the Senators, Jonathan has helped raise over $100,000 for EB awareness. There is no cure for epidermolysis bullosa. Most butterfly children don't make it to the age of 30. It's a reality 14-year-old Jonathan deals with head on. Have you thought a lot about the future?
Definitely. EB's a cruel thing. And yes, I've thought about it for sure. Like, how can't you? You know it's a reality. But I think I just pushed that aside. I'm here, and I'm gonna go step by step, day by day, and you never know what the future holds. I may live to 100. We can't know. But I'm not gonna stop anytime soon. I'm gonna keep going.
But Jonathan is not asking that his life be ended because he's going to die potentially when he's 30 or sometime before. If you think about a piece of paper, it's not hard to rip. I also have paper here. But when it's together, I can't rip it the way I just did that to this one sheet of paper. So when we can't completely eliminate someone's pain, we alleviate their suffering by loving them, being present to them, serving them. And when he was asked, what keeps him going? What did he say? Who remembers? He gets his strength from others. I mean, the whole theme of that documentary was team, being part of a team. And then when he found out that he wasn't alone, that there were other people who had his condition, it not only gave him comfort that he wasn't alone, but it motivated him to what? Become an ambassador. He wanted to find a cure, not just for himself. It was the presence of others being part of a team and not just one piece of paper that has motivated him to raise $100,000 to find a cure for EB. And so it's very important to remember, in light of this, the words of pro-life physician Dr. Will Johnson, who says, when you only see death as a solution, you throw creativity out of the window. Medical diligence goes out of the window. The need to actually solve the problem, the need to actually examine the patient and find the solution goes out the window. If we kill kids like Jonathan who have EB and are in excruciating pain, what motivation do we have to find a cure for EB? There's no more people for EB. We don't need a cure if they're gone. Creativity, as Dr. Johnson said, goes out the window. So in the face of physical pain, we want to respond with pain management, not assisted suicide and euthanasia. The next motivation is emotional pain. Emotional pain. One of the documentaries I watched of a man who wanted assisted suicide shared his life story. And what came out when they shared his life story was that he had been abandoned by his parents, forced into the foster care system. When he grew up, he got married, only to divorce his wife and begin a life as a practicing homosexual man. And when I learned all of this, I thought, this man has a history of fractured relationships. There is emotional pain in his life. And assisted suicide and euthanasia aren't going to get to the heart of that emotional pain. Instead, we need counseling. We need to help people through the pain that is not physical, but can be dealt with through the gift of counseling. To give you another example, related actually to the first example, there are times where people are in physical pain, but we can't seem to address their physical pain because their physical pain is actually a manifestation of emotional pain. And if we don't address that, then we aren't going to be able to fix even the physical pain. To give you an example, I was reading a story of a palliative care physician. I'll be talking about palliative care at the end of my presentation. But I was reading this story, and this palliative care physician who works with patients at the end of their life had a patient named Alice who had lung cancer. She was terminal, and she was in excruciating pain in her chest. And when he told Alice's story, he said it wasn't odd that Alice was in pain in her chest because she had lung cancer. But what was odd, he said, was that we couldn't seem to alleviate Alice's pain. And he said, I had had countless patients with the same kind of cancer as her, and we were always able to keep their physical pain in check. But we couldn't with Alice. And her pain was causing pain for me and my colleagues who were having a difficult time even going into the room where she was because she was writhing in so much pain. And he thought to himself, how can I fix this? And so he walked in, and he suddenly felt convicted to very gently put his hand on Alice's arm. And he said, Alice, I'm starting to wonder if I can't fix the pain in your chest, because maybe the pain is something I can't touch. Alice, I'm wondering if maybe the pain is in your heart. And this look of relief came over her face that someone finally understood. And she began to open up. And she vocalized that she had one daughter. And that daughter was soon to marry a man she did not approve of. That Alice felt that man was very bad and was going to hurt her daughter. And because Alice was terminal and didn't have much long left on this earth, she felt she needed to tell her daughter how she felt. And her daughter reacted very poorly and essentially estranged herself from Alice. And so Alice was in physical pain because it was a manifestation of the fractured relationship that was going on in her life. And assisted suicide and euthanasia aren't going to address that. And that is why I love the words of a country song, of all things, that I think are relevant to this point about emotional pain and helping people with counseling. And that's the words of a song by Tim McGraw. Many of you may be familiar with it. He sings about a man who, in his 40s, gets diagnosed with terminal illness. And the chorus says, I went skydiving. That's right, some of you know what. I went Rocky Mountain climbing. I did 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu. But the point I wanted to emphasize was the next line. He said, I loved deeper. I spoke sweeter. And I gave forgiveness I'd been denying. And then he sings, I hope you get the chance to live like you were dying. And it's often not until the end is obviously near that we come to our senses and realize, I do need to speak sweeter, and I do need to love deeper, and I do need to give the forgiveness that I'd been denying. But if we have assisted suicide and euthanasia, then we don't allow for that opportunity. The next reason often given is that someone feels like they're a burden. And so that's why they want assisted suicide and euthanasia. This is a problem. We have to acknowledge that. But it's the response that we need to focus on. I watched a documentary of a woman who was recently divorced, had a debilitating illness that would eventually kill her. So she had no support from her now ex-husband. She had one child, her daughter, who had just finished high school and who had planned to go on to university. And this daughter had postponed her own pursuit of post-secondary education in order to stay and help her mom. And her mom felt like she was a burden. And she wanted assisted suicide and euthanasia. And so our response has to be perspective. Holocaust survivor Dr. Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, has said the last of the human freedoms that can never be taken from us is the freedom to choose how to respond to the situation that we're in. We can't always control the settings we find ourselves in, but we absolutely can still control our response to the setting, to the situation. And that's what perspective is. So we need to help people see the same thing a different way. To give you a lighthearted example of perspective, one of my favorite board games is called Telestrations. I'm going to put up one of the images. Don't get confused, just follow my little red pointer. So the way it works is you get a little notepad here, and it has a word on it, such as doggy bag. So then on the next notepad, you have to draw a dog and a bag, or however you perceive a doggy bag would look. Then you pass it to the next person who is going to, on the next sheet of paper, write what they think that was. So this person guessed correctly. So then the next person gets doggy bag, and then they draw it, and this is how they perceived what a doggy bag would look like. Well, the next person's perspective was that that is a purse snatcher. So then the next person drew what they thought was a purse snatcher, and the perspective of the individual who viewed that is a man purse. So it's quite a fun game. Here's another example. You get wallflowers. Someone thought, I'm going to draw a wall with a flower, and someone thought that is a man in a wall. That's their perspective. So the next person who drew this, and that was perceived as Han Solo. So this next person, I think, did a fantastic job of Han Solo here, but that was viewed as a gangster. So then the next person drew this. So my point in all of this is perspective. You can look at the same thing as someone else and see it a different way. So when we get back to this list and someone sees burden, we need to help change their perspective and say, you know what? Something you see, I see as well, and that is the existence of a burden. But I see it a little differently. I have a different perspective. What I see as the burden is the disease. You see yourself. And I want to change that. The adjective burden belongs to the word disease, not the individual, my mom. Burdensome disease, not burdensome mom. We need to change our perspective and help people change theirs. The late, great Saint John Paul II, in his document on the Christian meaning of human suffering, said the following: we could say that suffering is present in order to unleash love in the human person, that unselfish gift of one's I on behalf of other people, especially those who suffer. The world of human suffering, he said, unceasingly calls for another world, the world of human love. And in a certain sense, man owes to suffering the unselfish gift of love that stirs in his heart and in his actions. Suffering unleashes love. And I tell you, that 18-year-old girl is going to learn more in the school of love by postponing her education and caring for her mother than she ever would by going directly to a post-secondary institution. Suffering unleashes love. And so when someone's reason for assisted suicide is that they're a burden, we need to change their perspective and help them see that they're giving us an opportunity to love. The fourth reason people have for why assisted suicide and euthanasia should be allowed is that they feel useless. And in a number of documentaries I saw, what struck me about several of them were the kinds of individuals who wanted assisted suicide and euthanasia and who were flying over to Switzerland to get it. And one in particular was a physician. Another one was a professor. And as I watched the stories of these men unfold online, I thought to myself, could it be that they feel useless because the danger of the kinds of careers that they had is that by our world standards, their worth was rooted in what they did. And because they accomplished so much and did so much by our world standards, that when they were incapable of doing what for so long they had done, they thought their life had no meaning. And so what we need to do is help people see their self-worth. That I and you, we are unrepeatable and we are irreplaceable because we exist, not because of a long list of accomplishments or a whole bunch of people who claim friendship with us. That we are individuals of dignity and worth because we are. And so that's why I love the following ad from the Canadian Down Syndrome Society. Celebrate being. It captures what should be our response in light of people's motivation being, I'm useless, which is, but you're still valuable, so it doesn't matter if you're useless by your standards, because you are. And I want to celebrate being with you. I just want to be with you. So I want to play for you a short video clip of an approach involving people at both ends of life that I believe reinforces the importance of self-worth being in our existence and that we need to celebrate being rather than self-worth being in our accomplishments. You're going to see a video about young children spending time with very old people. And young children and very old people, by our world standards, don't do much. They're kind of useless. But this video, by our world standards, important emphasis, not mine, but this video is going to emphasize the importance that we celebrate being.
What do you see?
A brown bear.
A brown bear. Does everybody
Mary
see a
McGovern
brown
is
bear?
95 years old, and one of her favorite things to do is to read to toddlers.
And what is that? A bird?
A bird.
A bird. What color is the bird? Red. Everybody knows that.
Luckily for Mary, she doesn't need to go any further than down the hall to find her young friends.
Oh, see, look in here as the little kids see.
Oh, yeah.
McGovern lives at Providence Mount St. Vincent, a nursing home in Seattle, Washington that also houses a daycare for children up to 5 years of age.
Can you hand out a scarf?
Thank you, honey. Thank you.
There you go.
Oh, thank you very much.
Butterfly.
Every weekday, 500 residents are joined by 125 children in the facility affectionately called the Mount.
Peekaboo.
Peekaboo.
I see you.
Administrator Charlene Boyd.
We wanted to create a place for people to come to live and not to come to die.
So in 1991, Boyd and other administrators added a high-quality preschool to the nursing home and created an intergenerational learning center, a community for the very old and very young.
Why is there this railing here?
This railing is here not for the kids, but it's here for residents. And it's a safety piece for a resident in a wheelchair to push themselves up and to hold on and to bring themselves to a standing position and watch the children through the window.
So they can stand here and look in.
They can stand here and look in. It's putting high quality childcare in a setting that links old and young together.
Say, have a nice day.
Making the magic between these two ages together, bringing joy to the residents and joy to those young children. It's just like this magical formula that happens every day.
Get a high five. There. She knows how to do a high five. Most of them, they're curious about me, why you're here. I tell them I'm here because when I was living in my house, when I got too old, I wasn't always walking straight and sometimes I would fall. And if I fell, I had to have some help to get up because I couldn't get off the floor. I want to hug your baby doll.
I think there are things that both parties take away from the interaction. It's not like a lifelong relationship, but just for that moment in time, they're both enjoying each other's company and getting something out of their relationship with that person in that moment.
Another one, give me a hug. Come on, good hug.
All of us have common needs to be recognized. All of us have common need to be loved, and all of us have common needs to share life together. And so these children bring life and vibrancy and normalcy. It's a gift. It's a gift in exposing young families to the positive aspects of aging, and it's a gift of also having children seeing frailty, normalcy, and that's part of that full circle of life.
He rocks his treetops all day long, hopping and a bopping and singing his song.
Intergenerational activities can be spontaneous or planned, like this sing-along.
There's 36 visits possible each week. So each classroom, 6 classrooms, has at least 3 visits, up to 6 visits.
In my heart.
The director of the center, Marie Hoover, says children become comfortable with elderly residents at an early age.
Whether they're in a wheelchair or in a walker, or maybe they're hard to understand, or you have to speak louder, it is just about who that individual is and they adjust. The kids just they really don't blink an eye. This is normal. This is just who this resident is.
93-year-old Harriet Thompson joined this sing-along on her way to the dining hall.
I usually like to go sit down for a while before dinner, but I heard them singing, so in we went.
What do you experience internally when you're around these children?
Happiness. Just plain old happiness. You know, yeah. It beats anything else. It beats television.
Boredom and loneliness are sort of the plagues of older adults.
There she goes. Yep.
There's nothing more delightful than seeing young children with noise, with laughter.
You see the residents and then hear the sound of the kids coming down the hall, and it's as though sunlight just came through the window.
It's as though sunlight just came through the window. Because there, at the Mount, they celebrate being. One of the care workers said, "We all have common needs: to be recognized, loved, and someone to share life with." And those needs have nothing to do with our accomplishments, what we've done, what we can be used for. Instead, we have needs to be recognized, loved, and someone to share life with. And so when that physician and when that professor are at the end of their lives, they still have those needs, and we can meet those needs by reinforcing their self-worth and celebrating being. The final reason, the main reason given that I want to highlight tonight is fear of a bad death, because it's imagined or because someone observed a loved one have a very bad death, and these tragic deaths have happened. The issue is over our solution. What is our response? Instead of assisted suicide and euthanasia, we want to have palliative care. So what is palliative care? Well, first of all, palliative care doesn't hasten or prolong death. It affirms life. It respects the individual and finds meaning in the natural process of dying. Being against euthanasia and assisted suicide is not being against death. It acknowledges death is a part of life, but we don't run to death. We allow it to come as it would come, and in the meantime, we try to celebrate being and live life as we're able to. It's about treating the whole person, so if there's fractured relationships, having counseling and different things like that. It's about not only helping the person dying, but helping their loved ones and even the caregivers together as a community find comfort, find connection, and find healing in what is a shared human experience, that process of dying. There is a palliative care physician by the name of Dr. B.J. Miller, who I'd like to tell you about. He has a TED Talk that I'm going to be playing a very short clip from, but I encourage you to watch the whole video that you can find online. Dr. B.J. Miller is his name. And he talks about how we need to have palliative care when people are dying. We need to have creative ways to enter into the process of death so that people aren't afraid, so that it isn't scary, but that it can be a beautiful thing as it naturally progresses. And in his talk, he shares some of his own story. Well before he became a palliative care physician, long before he was a med student, when he was just in college doing his undergrad, he was out one night with some friends, and they saw this old, apparently abandoned rail car, and they climbed the rail car, and there happened to be these cables hanging low when they got to the roof of the rail car. And he reached up and he grabbed them. And 11,000 volts entered his body through that arm and exited out his 2 feet. So as a college student, Dr. Miller lost his arm and both his legs, and he's still left with lingering pain, even in the absence of these limbs. He spent several months in a burn unit, and he tells this story about how one evening it had snowed, and the nurses were coming in for their shifts complaining about the snow and how it ruined their drive-in. They almost got in an accident, and so they hated this snow. And here he is, lying in pain in bed with no window in his room, but he does have his imagination. And so he starts to activate his senses by thinking about that beautiful white crystal-type fluff falling to the ground, illuminating the night with the whiteness of the snow covering the ground. And it was giving him joy just to think about that beauty. Well, the next day, with all that snow still there, one of the nurses smuggled in a snowball. And she put it on his hand, and he says, I cannot tell you the rapture I felt holding that in my hand, the coldness dripping onto my burning skin, the miracle of it all, this hard ice, contacting heat, suddenly melting, this act of nature, and he was enthralled by it. He was fascinated by it. And he talks about how in his palliative care and his hospice care, how it is so important to help people enter into the present moment. How they can find beauty wherever they are. And we need not rush death because there are opportunities in the present moments we have until death comes that ought to be embraced and ought to be celebrated. So here's a short clip from him.
Namely, we need to lift our sights, to set our sights on well-being. So that life can become, and health care can become about making life more wonderful rather than just less horrible. Beneficence. Here, this gets right at the distinction between a disease-centered and a patient or human-centered model of care. And here is where caring becomes a creative, generative, even playful act. Play may sound like a funny word here, but it's also one of our highest forms of adaptation. Consider every major compulsory effort it takes to be human. The need for food is birth cuisine. The need for shelter has given rise to architecture. The need for cover, fashion. And for being subjected to the clock, well, we invented music. So, since dying is a necessary part of life, what might we create with this fact? By play, I am in no way suggesting that we take a light approach to dying or that we mandate any particular way of dying. There are mountains of sorrow that cannot move, and one way or another, we will all kneel there. Rather, I am asking we make space, physical, psychic room, to allow life to play itself all the way out, so that rather than just getting out of the way, aging and dying can become a process of crescendo through to the end. We can't solve for death. I know some of you are working on this. Meanwhile, we can design towards it. Now, parts of me died early on, and that's something we can all say one way or another. I got to redesign my life around this fact, and I tell you, it has been a liberation to realize you can always find a shock of beauty or meaning in what life you have left. Like that snowball, lasting for a perfect moment, all the while melting away. If we love such moments ferociously, then maybe we can learn to live well, not in spite of death, but because of it. Let death be what takes us, not lack of imagination.
Let death be what takes us. At the end of the day, that's why assisted suicide and euthanasia are wrong. Because death doesn't take us. We take death. And that's fundamentally disordered. And we know that because we examined our human intuitions, because we looked at the nature of civil societies, and because we looked at the nature of the medical profession. Let death be what takes us, not a lack of creativity, not a lack of imagination. If you look at these reasons, and if the end point is assisted suicide and euthanasia, that's a lack of imagination. But if instead we look at all these reasons and we say, I'm motivated to find a cure for this pain. I'm motivated to fix my fractured relationships. I'm motivated to let this suffering bring out of me love. I'm motivated to celebrate being and just enter into existence with a fellow human being and marvel at our connection, our relationship, and the beauty of the moment. That is imagination. That's creativity. That is what Dr. Miller is talking about, and that is the alternative we want to propose to our culture instead of assisted suicide and euthanasia. So going from here, 2 practical things I want to encourage you to do. The first is all of you will get a copy, looking for it, of this little booklet I wrote so that beyond, hopefully, what you remember that I shared today, you will have something in writing that will equip you to be able to speak with people on the subject of assisted suicide and euthanasia. There's a pro-life society back in British Columbia that contracted me to do some speaking and writing for them, and that evolved into this being developed by them. And so there are copies on the table. Some of you already have copies, but there are more copies on the table if you didn't get one. So please take this, and from having this and from having the presentation, please be intentional about creating opportunities to engage in your sphere of influence people in conversation, asking them what they think about assisted suicide and euthanasia, what do they think about Bill C-14, and then use the information you were given tonight and bring that into the conversation. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is learn about the program Dying Healed. I'm just going to run across, I don't know how far I can go. Thank you. Oh, my papers were all taken, weren't they? Does someone have the Dying Healed? Can someone just pass me? It was, thank you. That's okay, you were allowed to take it. So Dying Healed is a beautiful initiative that Life Canada, a national pro-life organization, is launching this summer. And to me, it's a very practical way for us to be able to respond to assisted suicide and euthanasia. The whole premise behind their program is this: assisted suicide and euthanasia won't happen if people don't ask for it. So the way we make sure people don't ask for it is we love them and we spend time with them. And so they're developing a program where people like you and me will go to local elderly centers or hospitals within our cities and communities and volunteer our time, where we will go and literally be with people who are sick and dying. That is as simple as holding their hand, maybe reading to them, maybe listening to beautiful music with them. Nothing elaborate by the world standards, but profoundly significant by human standards, and that is connection. Someone who cares enough to consider it a priority to spend time with another person. And if people feel loved, then they won't be asking for this. This program isn't officially launched, and so what I encourage you to do is go to my website and sign up for my e-updates, which come every 6 to 8 weeks, so I'm not one of those people that blasts you often. And when the Life Canada program is released in more detail for how to take part in the Dying Healed program, I'll be announcing that to my mailing list. So the two practical things you can do: talk to people you know by using the booklet and using what I shared tonight, and then participate in a program like Dying Healed and be present to people in your midst. And if we do that, then I think we pass the test that Pearl S. Buck spoke about. The test of a civilization is how it treats its helpless members. Thank you very much.